The war in Afghanistan rages on as a major deadline looms for the United States forces to leave the country. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. It's almost 20 years now since U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan. They went after al-Qaeda terrorists following the 9/11 terror attacks, and they also removed the Taliban from power in Kabul. Then, in February last year, the Trump administration and the Taliban signed a peace deal that calls for American forces and their NATO allies to leave Afghanistan by May 1st. And as the violence continues and the deadline just weeks away, President Biden must decide what to do next: honor the agreement to leave or continue a U.S. military presence in America's longest war. It's a major decision. And to discuss all of this, joining me now here in Washington, D.C. is Omar Samad. He's a former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Joining us, too, via Skype is Ahmad Shah Mohibi. He has helped fight the Taliban, and he's the founder and president of Rise to Peace. Also joining us by Skype from Columbus, Ohio, is Peter Mansour, a 26-year veteran of the U.S. Army. He's the chair of military history at Ohio State University. And from Beijing, we are joined by Pakistani researcher and journalist Zun Ahmed Khan. She's a visiting fellow at Tsinghua University. Welcome all of you to the show. Omar, why don't I start with you? This May deadline fast approaching. Most analysts say Biden has three choices. He can go along with the Trump deal, remove all the forces from Afghanistan. He can try and work out an extension with the Taliban, or they can stay put. Walk us through the various options and what you think is likely to happen.
Yes, you're right. There are three immediate options given the couple of months that is left for the deadline. If you stay and you break the agreement that was signed with the Taliban, obviously the Taliban will react and you're back to square one. And so it's sort of, in a way, status quo. And that, I don't think, is the best thing to do under the circumstances, given the fact that Afghanistan is a land that is divided. The Taliban control more or less 50%, let's say, and the power, the balance of power is obviously not in the favor of either side. If you extend, I think that you have a chance, and that means that you can continue for a few more months to discuss a political roadmap and a solution and a settlement eventually. But in order to do so, you have to convince the Taliban that they have to agree to an extension, and that is where it becomes a bit complicated. It will require very strong diplomacy on behalf of the Biden administration, as well as regional I think buy-in, as well as support, and also Afghan factions agreeing, including the government, for such a plan. And the third option, obviously, is one also of continued war, and that means that America would have to either continue to expand, surge, keep it the way it is. It's, again, a scenario that is pretty bleak, in my opinion.
And Peter, on that subject of a surge, there's been a lot written about 2009 when he was vice president and how he strongly urged Obama not to go along with the Pentagon's efforts at a surge in Afghanistan, where it was a surge of 30,000 troops. He said people were sick of the war. It's likely that sentiment hasn't changed much. He did talk a little bit about his thinking recently as he addressed NATO allies on this subject. Let's listen to what President Biden had to say.
My administration strongly supports the diplomatic process that's underway and to bring an end to this war that is closing out 20 years. We remain committed to ensuring that Afghanistan never again provides a base for terrorist attacks against the United States and our partners and our interests.
So, Peter, listening to that, what do you get in terms of a sense of which direction he's leaning?
Well, the real problem is that the United States committed to removing its troops without a diplomatic solution to the conflict, and that removed the leverage that we had on the Taliban to come to a diplomatic agreement with Kabul. So I don't know what the Biden administration is going to do. They're not going to surge, for sure. They may add a few thousand troops at most if they decide to stay. I think the most likely option is that they'll try to engage all parties and work out an extension with the understanding that U.S. troops will leave as soon as there is a diplomatic agreement in place. And otherwise, it will be a war without end if we just extend into ad infinitum without any sort of a diplomatic solution to the conflict.
Ahmed, give me the scenario of what Afghanistan looks like if the United States and NATO forces were to leave.
Well, it's going to go back to, I would say, a civil war, given right now the Taliban not only the only problem, but the political community of Afghanistan. We have Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, we have that he has been threatening the Afghan government. We have the political parties that want an interim government, so that is a threat already there. The Taliban also wants the end of the current regime. So given that they're so vague from Biden administration, first what we need to have is a clear policy, a clarity and predictability for the Afghans, for Americans and allies. What is it that the U.S. wants to get out of Afghanistan? Because leaving Afghanistan is not a great strategy. If we look back in 1990s when Dr. Najibullah's government, the aid was cut, the Russians left, the civil war started. So we don't have to repeat the history. But what President Biden can do is look into what has been done in the past 3 presidents, and he's the 4th one. And well, for sure, political solution is the best one. Today I was speaking to 2 of the negotiators, Khalid Noor, who spoke about we need to have a deadline for the peace process. It means you're living in jacuzzis and 5-star style. That's not going to work. You have to put in deadline that Mr. Talib, you have to have certain amounts of time and weeks you have to negotiate with us. That's number one. I was talking to Dr. Amin Ahmadi, another negotiator from the Afghanistan team, and he was talking about that we need to reduce violence because peace process is a long process. And for that reason, we have over 10,000 people died last year. So to your question, there will be crisis. There are already crises right now, and it's going to be more bloody, and Afghans are uncertain what the future is going to look like.
More bloody, Peter. Biden also must remember the troop withdrawals. You were in Iraq in 2011. A lot of his opponents said that the withdrawal came too quick. They left Iraq too hastily, and as a result, that created a vacuum. ISIS moved in. There's a political dimension to all of this as well. Talk to us about that.
Well, certainly, if U.S. troops withdraw without a political agreement in place, there will be a uptick in the fighting. The Taliban will try to win a military victory, and there will be a lot of bloodshed, both civilian and military. It will not necessarily mean the end of the Afghan government, however. That really depends on how much the United States is willing to continue to bankroll Kabul and its military. And as long as the United States continues to do that, the Afghan government will probably withstand any attacks by the Taliban. And this is the lesson also of the period from 1989 to 1991. You know, when the Russians left, the Soviets left, the Afghan government didn't fall immediately. It only fell in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the funding dried up.
So, Omar, you know, Ahmed was talking about a clear policy. What would that look like from the United States? Because we do see these gyrations. You've got Bush, Obama, Trump, now it's Biden. What would a clear policy look like?
First of all, I hope it looks like having learned all the lessons from the last 20 years. And even for some people, having learned all the lessons for the last 42 years when the Afghan conflict erupted. I was 17 years old. I remember that day clearly. And then it was downhill since then. We've had very few periods of peace in Afghanistan since. We've tried, but we have failed. And we have failed because there are a lot of lessons that need to be learned, and we need not repeat them. So first of all, you cannot win this war through military means. That's one lesson. You have to find a political settlement, and you have to reach an agreement amongst Afghan parties, but you also need to have, obviously, as I said earlier, you have to have all the main stakeholders outside of Afghanistan, whether they are in the United States or whether they are in the region or anywhere else, who have to also have some legitimate say into what this looks like. But it's the Afghan people at the end of the day who have to pay the price. And what we need to do is end the carnage. We need to end this misery. Afghans have paid a dear price. We need to let them decide what the future looks like. We need to give them that opportunity. And the Taliban, whether we like it or not, are a part of that scene and a part of that new reality. So we need to make sure that It's an inclusive process. It is one where we share power or we create a new system where everybody can share power, and the Afghan people are relatively happy and content with that. It's a question of a process and how you take the steps to reach that settlement that is needed.
Zune, he's talking about major stakeholders. Of course, that brings to mind Pakistan. How are they viewing all of this, and what role would they like to play?
Well, I think firstly, Mike, that just like many of your panelists just mentioned, it is a situation where it seems that there are no winners so far. And especially when we talk about the Afghan people, the fact that they have been suffering 20 years of uncertainty means that the implications have been obviously spilling over the entire region. And Pakistan and Afghanistan, as most of us already know, have a very symbiotic relationship. So for Pakistan, we saw that recently Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, also visited Kabul. He was welcomed very warmly. And the intention is, from both sides, there seems to be sincerity that we can play a more conducive role, increasingly more conducive role in trying to facilitate a peace process and in trying to facilitate peace talks. But of course, on the question of whether it is time for the troops to leave, whether it makes sense to abide by the agreement that was made between the Taliban and the Trump administration, I think there should be absolutely no question about it, because not abiding by it would mean possibly escalation of violence. It could mean possibly further uncertainty, and not ending the war is the number one thing that has resulted in the state of confusion that we have. So let's talk about the fact that not enough infrastructure has been developed in Afghanistan. Let's talk about the fact that Pakistan for decades has been trying to deepen its connectivity economically through infrastructure to Central Asia, and now as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It all is possible, more than it ever was before. But stability and basic peace is a precondition in Afghanistan for any of that to happen. And that's why I think that the regional stakeholders are here to play a long-term role. They are long-term stakeholders in Afghanistan's peace, not just preventing another 9/11, which is obviously very important. It is the main reason that it's been over 20 years that the United States hasn't left. But for these regional players, it is not just security, but peace, stability, and the prosperity of Afghanistan that is meaningful. So I think the sooner we end the war and the more we understand that the region is willing and keen to play a role in facilitating the peace process.
Omar, I have to ask you about the current landscape, because we're witnessing this increase in violence of late, targeting the professional class. These are judges, journalists, professional women. They've all been targets. The President, Ashraf Ghani, talked about that in a recent video message to a virtual UN Human Rights Council meeting. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The recent wave of violence against our people, civil and civic institutions, from human rights and civil society organizations to the media, judicial, civil service, and security organizations, to farmers and traders, are indications of a systematic onslaught against our society. Targeted killings are the sharp edge directed against men and women, representing the profound transformation of our society during the last 20 years.
What's behind all these killings, Omar, and what does it tell us about what the future looks like in Afghanistan?
It's very troubling. It's a mix of different types of targets. Not only what President Ghani said, he only mentioned some. These targeted killings and assassinations that started about a year and a half or so include not only those groups, but also they include scholars, peace advocates, religious figures, people sympathetic to the Taliban, and as well as spoilers. It's very important to remember that there are those groups, radicalized groups, terrorist groups, extremist groups, disenfranchised groups, dissatisfied groups in Afghanistan who also want to muddy the water. So it's a very murky situation, but at the same time, let's not forget, these are troubling, but there are hundreds and thousands of other Afghans who are also being killed on a daily, weekly, monthly basis during the war, during bombardments, during shelling, during roadside bombings, and during fighting. There are not only Afghan men fighting on both sides who die, both on the security side of the government as well as on the Taliban, but also civilians who die in the hundreds and thousands. So we need to talk about all of them. We just do not need to talk about just one group, but all of the Afghans who are affected by this war.
Ahmed, you get the sense, though, that the government and the Taliban don't really see a path forward in terms of coexisting and potentially sharing government duties or sharing power, rather. I've seen reporting that Taliban leaders say that once the infidels, and that's how they describe the Western forces, once they're gone, the Afghan government will be gone as well. Here's what one spokesman had to say about the May 1st deadline. Let's listen to what he had to say. I want to get your reaction on the other side.
The staying on of troops beyond 14 months, whether American or NATO soldiers, means the continuation of Afghanistan's occupation. We have fought occupation for 20 years. Therefore, in this case, we will be forced to continue our fight and jihad.
So listening to that, how do you see the path forward?
Well, currently speaking, the Taliban have an upper hand at negotiations. They got a deal with the U.S. who removed them from power. They got 5,000 of their prisoners. They got 400 of their prisoners by name requested by Lua Jirga. They gone their reputation in the world. A Taliban insurgency, now they're meeting with Russians, Chinese officials, Iranians, Pakistan, everybody. So, and they can leave negotiations at any time. While I was speaking to negotiators today, they were telling me that the Taliban can easily walk out. Just like in the last 36 days that the peace talks were in stalemate, that was because the Taliban said, well, we don't want to talk. The past 19 years, the Taliban have repeatedly rejected the Afghan government, called them puppets, called them illegitimate, called them not Islamic regime. So on the other side, President Ashraf Ghani and his VP Amrullah Saleh, they're looking for continuation of power. So there's a couple of problems in Afghanistan. Number one, it's domestic. Everybody wants to rule. Every political power wants to have a slice of the pie. See, that comes economic freedom, and that comes the pie. So everybody gets a slice of the pie, then there will be no problem. But in Afghanistan, losing power is a problem. That's a traditional, that historically. So the Taliban, they're not after Islam, they're after power. The same thing what the other Afghans are looking at Afghanistan. So the government wants a continuation of power. The Taliban wants the removal of the power. The Americans wants to leave. The Afghan people do not know what to do. So in a scenario that everything is happening at the same time, first, we need to have a regional diplomacy in the United States working with a lot of actors, especially Pakistan. Pakistan have played a big role in bringing the Taliban to negotiation at first place, even in the last time, then there was a settlement. And number two, there has to be a political consensus among the Afghan leaders. As Mr. Omar was saying earlier, yes, it's at the end of the day, Afghans pay the price. And also, it's at the end of the day, Afghans can build their own country. And third, Afghanistan is really rich in minerals. Look at it like United States estimated there's about 3 mines of lithium in Afghanistan. So when we look at the CPAC, the Chinese investment corridor, and we look at it, the other international actors, at the end of the day, if everybody gets a slice of the pie, the war of economic can stop. So how to manage that? It goes back to the United States and the international community, a regional diplomacy. But given the status of the Taliban does not want the government does not want the Taliban, and the political community of Afghanistan wants a end of the regime, that is a complete chaos. So we need to lessons learned and put policies that could work, pressuring the Pakistan and Iran and the actors in the region that could pay attention to serious talks, because at the end of the day, Afghans are dying. And corruption, and giving 54% of the Afghans live below the poverty line. There has to be a solution. And that solution first has to start with reduction of violence. There has to be a reduction of violence while the political settlement takes place over the course of a couple of years. Otherwise, from one side hunger, from the other side violence, believe it or not, Afghanistan will suffer tremendously. And on last point, I want to mention the Taliban are attacking professionals. I was blocked on Twitter because when you talk against them, they want to stop you. But one thing they have neglected to understand, they're facing with a generation of educated Afghans that are well connected to the world, and that is their nightmare.
Zune, it's interesting, the U.S. and China have so many differences, and people have been talking about that considerably of late, but they do share an interest in that there's stability in Afghanistan. China, of course, borders Afghanistan. So how is Beijing viewing all of this, and what role do they play?
Well, I think, first of all, we can, as I earlier mentioned, look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a mechanism, a multilateral effort to connect the region in a deeper sense. I think, of course, the fact that Afghanistan and China share a border means that stability in Afghanistan, just like for Pakistan, for Tajikistan, for Iran, is integral to the long-term vision that they have for the region and for their own economic prosperity, their own plan to develop the western regions of China. So for sure, stability, not just stability, as I earlier said, prosperity in Afghanistan, better education, better opportunities, better infrastructure, all of that plays in very well with the kind of foreign policy that we see coming out of China. And I think here, I don't agree entirely that the US and China are exactly on the same page, because obviously the United States does want betterment for the Afghan people. But for China and for the region at large, it is something integral for their own stability, for their own well-being, and for their own connectivity that they envision as well. So it is definitely good that China and the US do see eye to eye on this on some level, but definitely on the question of ending the occupation, perhaps the regional players will want it much sooner, because the sooner the war ends, the sooner the process of meaningful dialogue and consensus between the parties within Afghanistan, and obviously the region can play a very profound role in this, can start. And that is something integral for whatever we want for the people who have been suffering the most. So it's definitely important to look into the mechanisms in place right now coming from Asia that can facilitate that process for Afghanistan.
Omar, one of my favorite books about Afghanistan of late was Jeffrey Stern's The Last 1,000, where he talked about a school in the area and how it was growing. But then American forces were leaving, and one of the people he talked to said that, you know, this is what's going to remain is instability, collapse, and factional war. I saw a recent interview with a woman in Kabul who said that, you know, the people feel like they're forgotten, that it's more important for a dignified exit for the United States rather than a lasting peace for Afghanistan. Can you talk to me about, you know, this sense of betrayal that some people have in Afghanistan about the U.S. leaving?
Well, I think the U.S. first has to look at it internally at itself and its role in Afghanistan and in that region and what its people want. We Afghans have obviously to look at how we can pull Afghanistan back together, how to reunite this country, how to rebuild this country, how, as Ms. Khan was saying, we can bring some level of stability and peace that can then translate into development, into connectivity across the region, into getting access to what our other friend was talking about, the minerals and the other resources that Afghanistan has, and the connectivity that it offers everybody, east, west, north, and south. So we really have to look at this in the larger prospect. Yes, individuals at levels either lose or win. There are those who have benefited from the American presence in Afghanistan and those who really haven't benefited. So if you look at both sides, you do realize that there is an imbalance. And so we need to bring balance back to Afghanistan and make sure that all stratas of society benefit from it, the region can benefit from it, and the world can be safer. So we need to, yes, focus on counterterrorism. We need to make sure that we have measures in place where the Taliban are not a threat, but they can be co-opted and they can become an ally alongside the Afghan forces, and making sure that the threat of terrorism is contained. So all of these things can be done. It just requires good diplomacy. It requires a political roadmap. It requires engagement, and it requires a lot of talking and negotiating. It does not require more fighting and killing and mayhem. I think that we have experienced that for 40 years, and the United States has experienced that for 20 years. So the United States has other priorities in the world. Western countries have other priorities today. We need to shift attention towards something that is most constructive and can end the mayhem that we have experienced.
Peter, talking about shifts in priorities, it seems like the shift here in the United States is towards domestic terrorism. But talk to me about the threat of terrorism still in the region. Do you see it as still percolating?
Well, it's still there. Al-Qaeda has not gone away, but it's certainly much less than it was before 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security has strengthened U.S. Aviation, U.S. borders. And so the threat from al-Qaeda and now ISIS as well has diminished over time. This would be perhaps one of the incentives for the Biden administration to leave Afghanistan, although it says that fighting terrorism is the reason it wants to stay. But look, Afghanistan is not going to stabilize until the division of power is determined. And right now, the Taliban think they can win. And as long as they believe that they can achieve through military force what they cannot achieve at the negotiating table, this war will go on, unfortunately. And with it, the potential for safe havens for ISIS and al-Qaeda to be reestablished.
June, Omar talked about those who've not benefited, those who have benefited. A lot of people point to women and girls and the advances over the last 20 years. Can they be reversed should things go south?
I think, firstly, we need to understand that perhaps there are definitely the circumstances for women in big cities like Kabul have improved a lot. I know many young Afghan women that are passionate about women entrepreneurship, women's rights, movements to make women be able to achieve higher education, which was not conceivable about 20 years ago, even a few years ago. So we see that that small niche, however, of women that have benefited, and that is extremely important for any society, especially developing countries. But let's look at the majority of women. Let's look at the fact that majority young girls in villages and small towns are not even able to go to school. Even if their parents want to send them to school, they're not able to go to school because there are no roads and there are no schools. So we have to understand that in the bigger picture, yes, the progress that women in some cities have made must be maintained. I hope that it can be. And I think any stakeholders will be making a mistake by taking steps the way we saw in the late 90s against women, because they also have to work with the region. I think we underestimate the influence that the importance of regional stakeholders can have. There are certain terms and certain ways in which we can all move forward together. However, that said, if we think that in these 20 years, because of the situation of the war, that overall 100% women's situation has improved, then I would disagree with that. And I hope that with the war ending and with hopefully the right political roadmap, the right direction forward, more young girls can just go to school. And this is something that we also need to focus on.
June, thanks so much. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Great discussion. An important date approaching us in May. That's it for this great discussion. Again, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu. Thanks so much for joining us on The Heat.